Hey, good afternoon, y'all. Thanks for tuning in to Poetry Lockdown. Once again, this is day 31, um, and I have a sonnet for you today by Marilyn Nelson, terrific African American poet. Um, and I love the sonnet form. I think I've read at least one. I know Patrick Kavanagh's epic was a sonnet. I think I might have read another one too. Shakespeare. Yeah, I read one of Shakespeare's sonnets. But I love the compression. 14 lines is all you have, and that compressing force often leads to incredible insight. So before I read Nelson's poem, which has a lot to do with both the art of poetry and also about teaching, um, and also some of the terrible things that teaching can do, um, as well as the powerful things a poem can do, I want to give you just a little background on the poet. So this is from an NPR article I linked to as an interview with the poet. And she actually, Marilyn Nelson, has written a number of children's books and poetry for children. And this, though it's the same title as the sonnet that I'm going to read, I don't think the sonnet is actually in this book, but it's How I Discovered Poetry. She's interviewing with NPR, and she says this book that she's writing, which the sonnet will deal with similar time period, says, um, Marilyn Nelson says, my father graduated in the last class of cadets from the flight school at Tuskegee. So they are now the Tuskegee Airmen, she tells All Things Considered host Aaron Rath. The story I tell, the family story, is of the family of an African American flying officer. Moving around the country as part of a military family, Nelson was often one of the first black children at her school. Those experiences had a profound impact on her point of view as an artist. Quote from her, back when I was in college, people used to talk about the alienation of the artist, she says, not ever quite fitting in any place. And that's definitely what we see here in this poem. So let me jump into it. Sonnet, How I Discovered Poetry by Marilyn Nelson. It was like soul kissing, the way the words filled my mouth as Mrs. Purdy read from her desk. All the other kids zoned an hour ahead to 3:15, but Mrs. Purdy and I wandered lonely as clouds borne by a breeze off Mount Parnassus. She must have seen the darkest eyes in the room brim. The next day she gave me a poem she'd chosen especially for me to read to the all except for me white class. She smiled when she told me to read it, smiled harder, said, oh yes, I could. She smiled harder and harder until I stood and opened my mouth to banjo playing, darkies, pickaninnies, disses, and dats. When I finished, my classmates stared at the floor. We walked silent to the buses, awed by the power of words. This is a terrific and a terrible poem. And as a teacher, an English teacher, my heart aches for the child Marilyn Nelson, and I'm really struck by the title, right? How I discovered poetry, because when you get to that turning point of the poem, where the speaker, who I think we can probably safely assume, Marilyn Nelson speaking from her own memory, when the speaker, poetic speaker, is called on to read this straitjacketing of what kind of words she can read as an African American young woman. It feels like the opposite of discovery. It feels like um, someone telling you to find your place, and we figured this out for you. So I'm really struck by that. And then I wonder, and this is me just thinking out loud. I mean, I've only been living with this poem for about a week, just kind of going back to it. But I wonder about the closing lines, when she finishes and her classmates stare at the floor. I wonder if this is kind of like this idea of like the via negativa, where you learn the power of something when it's absent, when the total disrespect of another person and disrespect of language is there. You start to see the power of words, and not only the speaker but her fellow classmates are, quote, awed by the power of words. And that's where I am right now with this poem. I'm incredibly moved by it, and also incredibly disturbed by it as a teacher. I know as a teacher there are things that I wish I could replay, um, and go back in time and say, I wish I had not said that thing. And this is like a horrifying example of something like that, but a terrific poem. So I think to close out, I'm just going to read it one more time and let you savor the language and the experience of Marilyn Nelson's poetry. Before I do that, I should also mention, if you are a fan of poetry and spirituality, Krista Tippett has interviewed a number of the poets. I think at least a couple that I've featured here, and she definitely has. I know she's got an interview of Marilyn Nelson that's terrific. So check it out. You go to On Being with Krista Tippett. I think you can find it. Here we go. How I Discovered Poetry by Marilyn Nelson. It was like soul kissing, the way the words filled my mouth as Mrs. Purdy read from her desk. All the other kids zoned an hour ahead to 3:15, but Mrs. Purdy and I wandered lonely as clouds borne by a breeze off Mount Parnassus. She must have seen the darkest eyes in the room brim. The next day she gave me a poem she'd chosen especially for me to read to the all except for me white class. She smiled when she told me to read it, smiled harder, said, "Oh yes, I could." She smiled harder and harder until I stood and opened my mouth to banjo playing, darkies, pickaninnies, disses, and dats. When I finished, my classmates stared at the floor. We walked silent to the buses, awed by the power of words. Thank you, Marilyn Nelson, for this amazing poem, and thank you all for listening.